Singapore is a sunny tropical island in Southeast Asia, off the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. Singapore is Asia's second smallest country. Singapore, on the other hand, is regarded as a global leader and innovative metropolis despite its size. The city-state is 710 square kilometers and inhabited by 5 million people from 4 major communities, and is the home to one of the most important ports in the world. But it was not always like this. In this video, we will look how Singapore became so rich despite massive challenges that could have prevented the country's development. In the 1960s, the city-state of Singapore was a developing country with a GDP per capita of only $320. Today, its economy is currently one of the fastest growing in the world. Given that Singapore is a small country with few natural resources, its economic progress is nothing short of astounding. By embracing globalization, free market economy, education, and sensible policies, the country has been able to overcome its geographic limitations and establish itself as a leader in international commerce. On August 31, 1963, Singapore declared its independence from the British monarchy and joined forces with Malaysia to form the Federation of Malaysia. As the two sides tried to merge with one another culturally, Singapore's 2 years as a member of Malaysia were plagued with social unrest. Violence and street rioting became all too common. In Singapore, there were 3 times as many Chinese as Malay people. The growing Chinese population on the island and peninsula worried the Malay authorities in Kuala Lumpur that it would threaten their political ideas and cultural identity. In order to ensure a Malay majority inside Malaysia proper and lessen the influence of communism, the Malaysian parliament opted to exclude Singapore from Malaysia. When Singapore gained its independence on August 9, 1965, Yusof bin Ishak was the island nation's first president and Lee Kuan Yew was its prime minister. Even after it became independent, Singapore still had problems. The 3 million citizens were primarily unemployed. Moreover, 2/3 of the city's population lived in squatter settlements and other urban slums on the outer edge. 2 significant antagonistic countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, surrounded the area. Singapore required adequate natural resources, adequate infrastructure, and adequate water supply. Lee begged for assistance from outside to encourage growth, but his appeals went unanswered, leaving Singapore to fend for itself. Singapore's economy during colonial times was based mostly on regional trade. However, throughout the post-colonial era, there were little opportunities for job growth due to this economic activity. The unemployment issue got worse once the British soldiers left. Starting a comprehensive industrialization plan with a focus on labor-intensive enterprises was the most feasible method to address Singapore's economic and employment difficulties. Sadly, Singapore has never had an industrial past. The majority of its labor force was employed in the commerce and service industries. They lacked the knowledge and skills necessary for speedy adaptation. Furthermore, without a hinterland or neighbors who would engage in commerce with it, Singapore was forced to look for opportunities far outside its limits to fuel its industrial expansion. Singapore's leaders began experimenting with globalization as a result of demand to provide jobs for their citizens. After observing how Israel was able to conduct business with Europe and America, despite being forcibly isolated by its Arab neighbors, Lee and his colleagues realized they needed to forge connections with the developed world and convince multinational corporations to locate their manufacturing in Singapore. In order to attract investors, Singapore needed to create an environment that was safe, free of corruption, and tax-friendly. In order to make this possible, the nation's citizens must give up a significant amount of their freedom in exchange for a more authoritarian government. Corruption and drug trafficking would be put to death if they were found. The National Trade Union Congress was established as a single party-controlled umbrella organization after Lee's People Action Party, PAP, crushed all independent labor organizations. Those who posed a threat to the corporate, governmental, or national unity were swiftly dealt with no regard for the law. International investors found the nation's harsh yet business-friendly policies to be particularly attractive. Singapore has a fairly stable political and economic environment, in contrast to its neighbors. Due to its favorable location and well-developed port infrastructure, Singapore was also an excellent manufacturing location. 7 years after gaining independence in 1972, the United States and Japan were both significant investors in 1/4 of Singapore's industrial enterprises, which were either foreign-owned or joint ventures. Singapore's gross domestic product, GDP, grew by double digits every year from 1965 to 1972 as a result of the country's stable weather, welcoming investment climate, and the rapid global economic expansion. Singapore began focusing on developing its human resources in addition to its infrastructure as foreign investment money poured in. The nation funded international corporations to train its unskilled workers in electronics, petrochemicals, and information technology through the establishment of numerous technical schools. The government enrolled those who were unable to find industrial jobs in labor-intensive non-tradable services like tourism and transportation. The nation enjoyed a lot of success with its plan to educate employees at multinational corporations. In the 1970s, Singapore exported primarily clothing, basic electronics, and textiles. By the 1990s, they had expanded into integrated circuit design, aerospace engineering, logistics, pharmaceuticals, wafer production, and biotech research. Even though Singapore's society is now highly developed and industrialized, the country's economy is still heavily reliant on trade. Singapore's port is now the busiest transshipment port in the world, surpassing Rotterdam and Hong Kong. In terms of total cargo handled, it has surpassed the port of Shanghai to become the second busiest port in the world. Today, intra-port trade continues to be an important part of the economy of Singapore. Singapore's tourism industry is also booming, with more than 10 million visitors annually. Banking has grown a lot in recent years, and new Swiss taxes have forced many assets that were held in Switzerland to be moved to Singapore. With drug companies like GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, and Merck & Co. opening factories there, the biotech sector is growing, and oil refining continues to be a major contributor to the economy. Singapore is now the 15th largest trading partner of the United States, despite its small size. Strong trade agreements have been signed with a number of South American, European, and Asian nations. More than two-thirds of the country's manufacturing output and direct export sales come from its more than 3,000 multinational corporations. Singapore is able to produce a GDP that exceeds $300 billion annually, more than three-quarters of the world, despite having a small labor force of only 3 million people and a land area of just 433 square miles. The highest life expectancy in the world is 83.75 years, ranking third. If you don't mind the strict rules, Singapore is considered to be one of the best places on earth to live. The business for freedom model of Singapore is highly contentious and the subject of intense debate. However, its efficacy cannot be denied, regardless of philosophy.